For 25 years, Judge Eleanor Kirkland ruled her courtroom like a dictator, silencing attorneys, bending the law, and sending innocent men to prison. But today, one man is about to change everything. For attorney Marcus Bennett, this isn't just another case, it's personal. He spent years gathering evidence, waiting for the perfect moment to expose her corruption. But taking down a judge this powerful could cost him everything. If he fails, will justice ever stand a chance? If you believe no one should be above the law, smash that like button, drop a comment, and let's make sure stories like this get heard. Share this with someone who still believes in real justice. Now, let's step inside the courtroom and witness a battle that could change everything. Jackson, the courthouse, Alabama. The heat outside was suffocating, but inside courtroom 3, the air was even heavier. Not from the weather, but from something far worse. A kind of unspoken oppression soaked into the very walls, lingering in every breath. The murmurs faded. The shuffling of papers ceased. Everyone settled into place. But not out of comfort, out of understanding. Because in this courtroom, the outcome was never a mystery. And at the center of it all sat Judge Eleanor Kirkland. She perched on the bench, not just above the courtroom but above justice itself. Her glasses rested low on the bridge of her nose, allowing her to glare over them with the sharp, calculating gaze of a ruler surveying her kingdom. Her silver hair was pulled into a strict bun, not a single strand out of place, like her power. Undisturbed. Absolute. For 25 years, Kirkland had presided over this court, deciding fates with an iron grip. She wasn't just a judge. She was the system. She rarely raised her voice, she didn't need to. A sigh. A raised eyebrow. The slow click of her gavel against the desk. That was all it took to remind everyone who held the power here. Because in this courtroom, the rules were clear. If the defendant was black, he had already lost. If his lawyer was black, his arguments were nothing more than wasted breath. And if anyone dared challenge how things worked here, they didn't last long. It wasn't just bias. It was something darker. Something entrenched. People had tried to fight back before. A young public defender had once raised his voice, protesting a verdict. He lost his license to practice law 3 months later. A fellow judge had questioned one of Kirkland's rulings. He quietly resigned 6 months after that. No one won against Eleanor Kirkland. No one even tried anymore. But today, someone was about to. A pair of footsteps echoed across the marble floor. Steady. Deliberate. Not rushed. Not hesitant. A presence that refused to shrink beneath the weight of this place. Marcus Bennett. He wasn't like the others who had walked into this room before him. He wasn't avoiding her gaze. He wasn't fidgeting with his tie or shifting uncomfortably in his seat. He wasn't here to play the game Kirkland had spent decades perfecting. Because today, Marcus wasn't just here to defend his client. He was here to bring Eleanor Kirkland down. The sharp click of polished leather against marble cut through the thick silence of courtroom 3. A measured rhythm. Unhurried. Unshaken. Marcus Bennett walked with a kind of confidence that didn't need to be announced. It was felt. In a room where people either cowered or conformed, he did neither. His dark suit was crisp. His shoulders squared. His gaze steady. This wasn't just another case. He had stood in courtrooms like this before. Rooms where justice was a formality, and verdicts were decided long before anyone ever set foot inside. But today was different. Today, he wasn't just here to defend a man. He was here to dismantle a legacy of corruption. One that had been left unchecked for far too long. As he stepped forward, eyes shifted toward him. Some curious. Some wary. Some already writing him off. He could feel the tension, thick in the air. The unspoken truth that had ruled this courtroom for years. Men like him weren't supposed to win here. And Judge Eleanor Kirkland made sure of that. Her gaze flickered toward him. Sharp. Assessing. Not startled. Not surprised. No. She had heard of him before. A troublemaker, some called him. A nuisance. The kind of lawyer who didn't just fight cases, but fought the system itself. Kirkland's expression didn't change. But something shifted in the air between them. A silent battle line, drawn. Before a single word was spoken. For 25 years, she had reigned without challenge. Today, that ended. Marcus adjusted the cuffs of his shirt. His movements deliberate. He wasn't just stepping into a courtroom. He was stepping onto a battlefield. And he knew, he wouldn't leave here the same. Seated at the defense table, hands clasped, shoulders hunched, Jamal Rivers looked like a man who had already been condemned. Not because of guilt. But because the system had never been designed to see him as anything else. The orange jumpsuit was gone, replaced by a borrowed suit. Too big at the shoulders. The cuffs, slightly frayed. But it didn't matter. To this courtroom. To the woman sitting on that bench. He was still just another black man in chains. The evidence against him was paper thin. A grainy surveillance video showing a man in a hoodie. No clear face. No identifying features. A single eyewitness. An older white store clerk who had hesitated when making his statement, as if searching for the right words. A weapon found miles away. With no fingerprints. No direct tie to Jamal. But here, in Judge Kirkland's courtroom, facts had never mattered as much as perception. And the perception was clear. A black man. A robbery. A case that should have been dismissed before it even reached trial. Yet, here he was. His eyes flickered toward Marcus. Searching for something. Hope, maybe. A lifeline, in a place where men like him weren't given second chances. Marcus met his gaze. Steady. Unwavering. A silent promise passed between them. Not today. Not this time. Because today, Marcus wasn't just here to argue a case. He was here to make sure that, for the first time in this courtroom, the truth actually mattered. The trial had barely begun, and the game was already rigged. Marcus stood at the defense table, his voice firm, his argument precise. Your Honor, the prosecution just introduced evidence that was never disclosed in discovery. That's a clear violation of Brady versus Maryland. Judge Kirkland didn't even blink. Denied. Just like that. No deliberation. No consideration. No pretense of fairness. Marcus held his ground. Your Honor, with all due respect, this is a fundamental violation. Kirkland exhaled sharply, barely masking her annoyance. Mr. Bennett, if you want a grandstand, I suggest you do it somewhere else. This court has no time for theatrics. Marcus clenched his jaw. Theatrics. That was what she called due process. That was what she called the law when it was being used against her. On the other side of the room, Travis Holden, the young, eager prosecutor, sat stiffly at his table. Fresh out of law school. Still learning which way the wind blew. But here, he didn't need to be good. He just needed to follow Kirkland's lead. She guided him like a puppeteer, smoothing over his fumbles, turning his missteps into advantages. Mr. Holden, she said, her voice softer now, almost maternal. Let's move on. We wouldn't want to waste the jury's time. Marcus caught the way Holden's back straightened. How confidence seeped into his posture as he nodded, flipping through his notes. Of course. The judge was on his side. She always was. In the jury box, a few members shifted uncomfortably. They weren't blind. Even the ones who had walked in today expecting Jamal to be guilty could see what was happening. And in the gallery, the reporter's pen scratched against notepads a little faster. They all felt it. The shift. The discomfort. The undeniable fact that this wasn't just bias. This was something worse. But no one spoke. Because in this courtroom, silence wasn't just expected. It was survival. Marcus knew that. He had known it before he walked through those doors. But today, he had no intention of staying silent. The courtroom felt different now. The shift was subtle but undeniable. Marcus Bennett knew how to read a room. He had spent years standing in places like this, where the walls weren't just lined with legal books, but with unspoken rules. Silent threats. Expectations set long before the trial even began. But today, he wasn't here to follow expectations. He was here to break them. He turned toward the witness stand. His steps measured. Controlled. Every move was calculated. Every second, intentional. He didn't need to rush, because the truth was already working in his favor. Seated in front of him was Harold Whitmore, the prosecution's star witness. A man in his late 60s. Thin, with nervous hands that wouldn't quite stay still. Marcus didn't speak right away. Instead, he let the silence stretch, watching as the weight of it settled onto Whitmore's shoulders. The jury was watching now. The reporters were scribbling notes. And Judge Kirkland. She was still unreadable. But Marcus didn't miss the way her fingers curled slightly against the bench. Finally, he broke the silence. "Mr. Whitmore," he said smoothly, his voice calm, steady. "You testified under oath that you saw my client, Jamal Rivers, at the scene of the robbery." "That's correct?" Whitmore cleared his throat. "Yes, sir." Marcus tilted his head slightly. "You're sure?" A flicker of hesitation. "Just for a second. I mean, I saw someone who looked like him," Whitmore said. There it was. Marcus let the words hang in the air, deliberately turning toward the jury, as if letting them absorb what had just been said. "You think you saw him?" he repeated softly. "That's not quite the same as knowing you saw him, is it?" Whitmore's fingers twitched. I mean, it was dark, but in your original statement to the police," Marcus cut in, flipping open a file on his desk. "You said, and I quote, 'I didn't get a good look at him. It was dark. I only saw him for a second.'" Silence. In the jury box, a few heads turned slightly, exchanging glances. "In that statement, you weren't sure at all, were you, Mr. Whitmore?" The old man shifted in his seat. I just remembered more later." Marcus leaned in slightly, his eyes locked onto the witness. "Did you remember, or did someone help you remember?" Whitmore swallowed hard. The tension in the room tightened. And Marcus knew this was the moment. The crack in the foundation. But he wasn't finished. With deliberate slowness, he walked back to the defense table, reaching into his briefcase. Not rushing. Not forcing. Letting anticipation do the work for him. "Your Honor," Marcus said, his voice shifting. Stronger now. Sharper. "The defense has obtained evidence that calls this entire case into question." Judge Kirkland stiffened. Slightly. Marcus pulled out a series of surveillance stills, placing them on the evidence screen. The images flickered onto the monitor for the jury to see. This footage, taken from a different angle than the one the prosecution presented. He paused, his eyes sweeping across the jury, making sure they were with him. "Shows that the suspect in the video." Another pause. "Is at least 2 inches shorter than my client." A ripple of whispers swept through the courtroom. Marcus didn't react. Instead, he reached for another document. This time, a financial report. "And here," he continued, "is proof that Mr. Whitmore received a direct deposit of $5,000 just days after identifying my client." A reporter in the gallery gasped. Someone in the jury let out a breath. Even the prosecution's young attorney, Travis Holden, looked rattled. Flipping through his notes, like the answer might magically appear. Marcus turned back to the witness stand. His voice was steady. His words unshakable. "Mr. Whitmore," he said, pausing just enough for the tension to settle. Do you still stand by your testimony? Whitmore's face paled. His lips parted. But no words came out. Because now, the truth had spoken louder than he ever could. For the first time in 25 years, Judge Eleanor Kirkland was no longer in control of her courtroom. And she felt it. The way the jurors shifted uncomfortably. The way the reporters' pens moved faster across their notepads. The way even her own prosecutor sat frozen, his hands gripping his notes like a drowning man clinging to a lifeline. The weight of truth had settled over the room. And Kirkland hated it. Her fingers tightened against the bench. Her lips pressed into a thin line. And then she snapped. Enough. Her voice sliced through the air. Sharp. Commanding. But this time, it didn't land with the same force it once had. She turned her gaze to Marcus. And for the first time, her carefully composed mask cracked. Judge Kirkland's eyes burned with fury. You think you're clever, Mr. Bennett? She spat, the formalities slipping from her voice. Parading around this courtroom like you're some kind of hero? You're nothing more than a cheap lawyer with a flair for theatrics. Marcus didn't flinch. He didn't even blink. He simply adjusted his tie, slow and deliberate, then took a single step forward. Controlled. Calculated. And you, Your Honor, he said smoothly, his voice calm but edged with steel, are dangerously close to proving everything I've been saying about you. A ripple of whispers spread through the gallery. Kirkland's expression darkened. She wasn't used to being challenged. She wasn't used to losing. You're testing my patience, Mr. Bennett, she warned, her voice lower now, laced with something venomous. One more outburst, and I will hold you in contempt of court. Marcus tilted his head slightly, feigning curiosity. For what, exactly? His tone was measured. For asking this court to follow the law? Another murmur from the jury. Someone in the gallery let out a quiet chuckle before quickly stifling it. Kirkland's grip tightened around her gavel. She was losing them. She could feel it. The absolute control she had wielded for decades. And Marcus. He knew it too. He wasn't just defending his client anymore. He was leading her straight into her own downfall. You are out of line, Mr. Bennett. Kirkland snapped, slamming her gavel down once. Twice. A third time. Marcus didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. But he took another step closer. His voice calm. Unwavering. No, Your Honor, he said, his words cutting through the tension like a blade. For the first time in this courtroom, you are. The silence that followed wasn't just heavy. It was explosive. The courtroom stood still. Frozen. Judge Kirkland sat rigid, her face tight with barely concealed rage. She had lost control. And she knew it. But what she didn't know, what no one in this room knew, was that Marcus Bennett wasn't finished. He turned. Slow. Deliberate. Reaching into his briefcase once more. The tension in the air stretched, like a wire pulled too tight. Something was coming. Kirkland narrowed her eyes. She sensed it. Your Honor, Marcus said, his voice smooth, steady, dangerously calm. Since we're discussing facts, I'd like to submit one final piece of evidence into the record. The jury leaned in. The reporters lifted their pens. Even Travis Holden, the young prosecutor, sat frozen. His face pale as he glanced at the judge. Because he knew too. Marcus placed a thin, sealed manila envelope onto the defense table. He didn't open it. Not yet. Instead, he let his fingers rest lightly against it. Letting the moment breathe. This, he said, looking directly at Kirkland, is something I believe the court will find illuminating. A muscle twitched in Kirkland's jaw. You're playing a dangerous game, Mr. Bennett, she said, her voice low, measured. But not as steady as before. Marcus lifted a brow. "No, Your Honor," he replied, his fingers tapping once against the envelope. "I'm playing to win." And then, with the slow precision of a man who already knew the outcome, he broke the seal. The truth was about to break this courtroom wide open. Judge Eleanor Kirkland sat high on the bench, her spine stiff, her gavel still gripped tightly in her hand. She had lost ground. Yes. But not the war. Not yet. She could feel the eyes in the room pressing against her. The jury. The reporters. Even her own prosecutor. All questioning. All second-guessing. It didn't matter. Because she still had power. Because she was still the judge. And as long as she controlled this courtroom, she could still bury this case. Still silence Marcus Bennett. Still remind everyone who truly ruled here. She opened her mouth, ready to dismiss whatever so-called evidence he was about to present. Ready to shut him down once and for all. Then, the doors burst open. A heavy thud against the walls. The sound cutting through the courtroom like a blade. The reaction was immediate. Gasps. Chairs scraping. Whispers tightening into a stunned hush. Every head turned toward the entrance. And there, framed in the doorway, were two men. Dark suits. Cold expressions. Federal badges gleaming under the fluorescent lights. The energy in the room shifted. No. It collapsed. The once heavy air of Kirkland's authority. Gone. Evaporated in an instant. She felt it. A ripple of uncertainty. A crack in the foundation of her control. Her fingers curled tighter around the gavel. "This is a courtroom," she snapped, her voice harsher than intended. I don't know what you think you're doing here, but..." One of the agents stepped forward, pulling a folded sheet of paper from his jacket. His voice was calm. Too calm. "Judge Eleanor Kirkland," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "We need to speak with you immediately." And just like that, the entire room held its breath. For 25 years, Judge Eleanor Kirkland had ruled her courtroom with absolute authority. And even now, with federal agents standing in front of her, she refused to believe that was about to change. She tightened her grip on the gavel, knuckles white, as if holding onto it could somehow keep her control from slipping. "You're in the middle of a trial," she snapped, her voice sharp, commanding. "This is a courtroom, not a circus. Whatever this is, it can wait." The lead agent didn't blink. Didn't even hesitate. "No, Judge Kirkland," he said, voice steady. "This can't wait." The tension in the room coiled tighter. This wasn't just about one kid. This wasn't about Jamal Rivers anymore. This was something much bigger. The agent unfolded the document in his hands, his voice cutting through the air like a blade. "Eleanor Kirkland, you are under federal investigation for bribery, obstruction of justice, and repeated violations of civil rights law." A ripple of gasps spread through the courtroom. Kirkland's lips parted, but no words came. The agent continued, unrelenting. "For over 2 decades, you have presided over cases in which defendants, primarily black men, were denied due process. You have accepted financial incentives in exchange for predetermined rulings. You have manipulated sentencing recommendations to benefit private interests." This time, the reaction wasn't just shock. It was recognition. Because deep down, they had all known. The lawyers who had lost cases before they even stepped into this room. The defendants who had seen their future signed away with a stroke of her pen. The jurors who had felt the invisible weight pressing down on them, guiding their decisions before a word had even been spoken. They had known. They just never thought they'd see this day. Kirkland let out a sharp breath. Her mask of composure cracking. "This is absurd," she snapped. But her voice lacked the unwavering authority it once held. Judge Kirkland's voice wavered, just enough for the courtroom to hear. "A baseless, politically motivated attack on my reputation," she declared, her tone rising, desperate now. Marcus Bennett stood tall. His presence was no longer just that of a defense attorney. He was something more. A man who had seen the system fail too many times. A man who had waited for this moment. Not just for his client, but for every client who had never had this chance. He stepped forward. Slowly. Deliberately. "Tell me, Judge Kirkland," he said, his voice calm but edged with steel. "How many innocent men sat in his chair?" He gestured toward Jamal. "And never got the chance to defend their reputation?" Silence. Kirkland's breath shallowed. Her pulse hammering beneath the surface. Because she knew. This wasn't just an accusation. This wasn't just one case. One trial. One moment of reckoning. This was everything. The years of power she had wielded like a weapon. The lives she had dismantled without a second thought. The rulings she had made. Not in the name of justice, but in the name of power. And for the first time in her life, she wasn't the one passing judgment. She was the one on trial. For 25 years, Eleanor Kirkland had commanded this courtroom with absolute authority. But now, as she stood behind the bench, fingers gripping the gavel, she felt something she hadn't felt in decades. Fear. It started as a crack. Small. Barely noticeable. But now, it was spreading. Widening. Threatening to consume everything she had built. Her breath came sharper. Her voice, rising. "This is an outrage." She snapped, her tone edged with something dangerously close to panic. She pushed herself to her feet. The gavel slipping from her grasp. Clattering loudly against the desk. "This is a politically motivated attack," she continued. "A disgraceful, orchestrated attempt to tarnish my name. I have upheld the law with integrity for 25 years. She gestured wildly toward the agents. "You." Her voice trembled. "You have no authority over me." The two agents remained motionless. Unshaken. Her words, once enough to make seasoned attorneys shrink, now fell flat in the silence. The energy in the room had shifted. Permanently. From the gallery, quiet murmurs grew louder. The jury exchanged glances. Some leaning forward, as if suddenly seeing her for what she truly was. Her heart pounded. She had to regain control. Her eyes flickered to the phone on her desk. There was still a way out. She reached for it. Fingers trembling as she scrolled through her contacts. Pressing a number she knew by heart. A name that had once guaranteed protection. The line rang. Once. Twice. A third time. No answer. She swallowed hard. Pressed the call again. Her pulse hammering beneath her skin. Another ring. Then. Voicemail. Her stomach twisted. For the first time, she realized the truth. No one was coming. The protection she had always relied on. Gone. The power she had wielded for decades. Slipping through her fingers. The phone fell from her grasp. Clattering onto the desk. But she had one last move. She turned sharply. Her gaze landing on the courtroom officers. The very men who had stood at her side for years, enforcing her rulings without question. Her voice cut through the thick silence. "Stop them." No one moved. A flicker of disbelief crossed her face. She clenched her jaw. "That's an order." Still. Nothing. She searched their faces. Expecting obedience. Loyalty. Fear. But instead, she found only indifference. The very men who had once enforced her will, who had watched in silence as she destroyed lives, now refused to meet her eyes. Kirkland's chest rose and fell in shallow, uneven breaths. Her hands trembled. Her vision blurred at the edges. She opened her mouth. One last desperate attempt to command control. But it was already over. And for the first time in her life, she wasn't the one giving the verdict. The courtroom stood frozen. Judge Eleanor Kirkland, the woman who had controlled this space with an unyielding grip for over 25 years, now stood motionless. Her once commanding presence reduced to nothing more than a shadow. Her breath came in sharp, uneven pulls. She had fought. She had denied. She had ordered. None of it mattered now. The lead federal agent stepped forward. Methodical. Unwavering. He unfolded a document. The sound of crisp paper slicing through the air like the final stroke of a gavel. His voice was steady, cold with authority. Eleanor Kirkland, you are under arrest for multiple counts of bribery, obstruction of justice, and willful violations of civil rights under federal law. The words struck like a hammer. A low gasp rippled through the gallery. A few members of the jury shifted uneasily in their seats. But Kirkland, she didn't move. For over 2 decades, the agent continued. You knowingly abused your position to deny defendants a fair trial. You manipulated evidence. You accepted financial compensation in exchange for predetermined rulings. You sentenced innocent men, many of them people of color, without due process. Her lips parted slightly, as if to object. But there were no words left. There was no argument to make. There was no power left to wield. The agent gave a small nod. Then came the handcuffs. A clean, metallic snap. The sound cut through the courtroom. Sharp and final. Like the toll of a bell. Marking the end of an era. Kirkland flinched. For a fraction of a second. Her body tensed. As if instinctively preparing to resist. But she didn't. Her shoulders sagged. Her chin dropped. And then, in the slowest of movements, she bowed her head. She had spent years sitting in judgment. Years dictating the fates of others with cold indifference. And now, her own fate had been sealed. The agents took hold of her arms, guiding her down the steps. Past the jury. Past the gallery. Past the very people who had once feared her. Now, they only watched. No one stood. No one spoke. Because for the first time, Eleanor Kirkland was truly alone. And as the heavy courtroom door swung open, the last thing she heard, before disappearing into the world she had once ruled, was the sound of justice. Relentless. Inescapable.